The marble corridors of a Roman villa echo faintly with whispers. Oil lamps flicker against painted walls, illuminating scenes of gods and lovers, of heroes seducing nymphs, of Venus rising from the sea. A maidservant slips silently through the doorway, carrying a small box of cosmetics, powders of chalky white, jars of red pigment, brushes carved from bone. Somewhere deeper inside the house, a woman prepares herself for a night that is as much ritual as it is intimacy. To the Romans, sex was never a purely private act. It was a mirror of power, of social order, of cosmic balance. The boundaries between personal pleasure and political consequence were paper-thin. In these chambers, behind closed doors, alliances were sealed, reputations made or destroyed, and entire dynasties secured or shattered. And yet, much of what we know today comes not from grand histories, but from an accident of disaster. In the year 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupted, freezing the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum beneath a rain of ash and pumice. Alongside villas and marketplaces, the eruption preserved the most intimate details of Roman life. Frescoes of couples entwined, graffiti scrawled with crude jokes and confessions, brothels with stone beds still intact. Time itself seemed to pause, holding a mirror up to a culture that dared to intertwine desire with empire. But if Pompeii gives us the texture of everyday sexuality, Roman morality gives us the structure. At its heart was pudicitia, a word often translated as chastity or modesty, but in truth much deeper. Pudicitia was the virtue that defined a woman's worth. It was her honor, her respectability, the invisible currency that allowed her family to rise or fall in Rome's brutal hierarchy. A woman who guarded her chastity was praised as the guardian of her lineage, one who did not risk ruin not only for herself, but for every man connected to her. Consider the figure of Livia Drusilla, wife of Rome's first emperor, Augustus. Outwardly, she was the very embodiment of pudicitia, a matronly figure who spun wool, avoided ostentation, and projected an image of almost divine virtue. Statues of her show her veiled, serene, a Roman Madonna long before Christianity arrived. But behind this facade lay whispers of manipulation. Ancient gossip claimed she schemed to place her son, Tiberius, on the throne, perhaps even poisoning rivals to clear his path. Whether true or not, the rumors reveal a paradox. Even the most virtuous Roman woman could wield her sexuality and her image as a weapon of power. It was here, in this tension between virtue and desire, that Roman sexuality lived. For men, sexual freedom was largely assumed. A Roman citizen could sleep with slaves, prostitutes, or concubines without staining his honor. His reputation depended not on with whom he slept, but on how he did it. To be the penetrator was to remain dominant, masculine, in control. To be penetrated, whether by another man or by a woman, was to risk humiliation, to invite whispers of weakness. For women, the stakes were infinitely higher. Their bodies were political property, their choices tightly policed. A noblewoman's affair could spark scandal on a scale that threatened imperial stability. The historian Tacitus tells us that Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius, took her lust so far as to stage a mock wedding with her lover, Gaius Silius. For this crime, this blending of private passion with public defiance, she was executed. The lesson was clear: female desire could topple dynasties. And yet, desire always found ways to seep through marble walls. Love poems by Ovid, Catullus, and Propertius whisper of stolen kisses, of secret trysts in the shadows of temples. Graffiti in Pompeii records not only vulgar boasts but also tender confessions. Successus loves Iris, one reads, she who does not care for him. Another, Admetus was here. Farewell, sweet Secundilla. These words, scratched by anonymous hands nearly 2 millennia ago, remind us that beyond politics and power, Roman sexuality was also deeply, painfully human. But even human desire could not escape Rome's obsession with hierarchy. The household itself was a miniature empire. The paterfamilias, the male head of household, was sovereign. His wife was expected to embody virtue. His children owed him obedience. His slaves, meanwhile, were not only laborers but also extensions of his will, their bodies available at his command. In this way, the Roman bedroom was not merely a place of intimacy, but a stage where the empire's values of domination, submission, and control were rehearsed night after night. Step into these marble corridors, then, and you enter not just a home but a theater. Every gesture, every touch, every whisper carries weight. In the flutter of a bride's veil, in the smear of toxic rouge across pale cheeks, in the silent obedience of a slave holding a silver mirror, the Romans revealed who they truly were. A civilization that conquered the known world, yet remained forever captive to its own desires. And so, as we begin our journey into the secret world of Roman intimacy, remember this. Here, nothing was merely private. Sex was politics, beauty was poison, desire was power. And behind every closed door, history was being written. One bed, one body, one whispered promise at a time. The Roman wedding was not simply a union of two hearts. It was a contract, a negotiation, a transaction inscribed in flesh and ceremony. Beneath the garlands of flowers and the solemn chants of priests, marriage was a battlefield of status, property, and political ambition. Imagine the scene: a Roman bride, her body cloaked in a flame-colored veil known as the flammeum. Beneath the veil, her hair is parted into 6 braids, tied with woolen bands, a symbol not of beauty but of submission, the same hairstyle worn by Rome's Vestal virgins. Her lips may tremble, but her silence is demanded. She is led, not to a lover but to her husband's household, passing through its threshold as if crossing into enemy territory. The ceremony itself carried echoes of conquest. In its earliest form, marriage by confarreatio was a ritual shared by Rome's nobility. The bride and groom sat together, hands clasped, before the gods Jupiter and Juno, as priests sacrificed a spelt cake. But behind the solemnity lay an unsettling truth. Marriage often resembled abduction. One of Rome's oldest myths, the rape of the Sabine women, told of Rome's founders stealing brides from neighboring tribes. The story was retold not as shame but as destiny. The message lingered: a woman's body was not her own, it was the soil upon which empires were built. For noble families, marriage was politics made flesh. Alliances were sealed through dowries, sometimes vast enough to rescue failing fortunes. A daughter's hand might unite rival clans, cement friendships, or serve as a peace treaty. Love, if it came at all, was a luxury. Cicero, the great orator, once admitted that his marriage was arranged for political advantage. His letters reveal more concern for his wife's family connections than for her companionship. But once the ceremony ended, once the veils and chants gave way to shadows and silence, the heart of marriage began, the wedding bed. Here, the bride was expected to surrender, to prove her pudicitia, her chastity, and to begin the labor of producing heirs. For the groom, this was not simply intimacy but duty to the state. Augustus himself passed laws punishing those who refused to marry or produce children, seeing every womb as a resource for empire. Yet, for all its solemnity, the Roman wedding night was haunted by contradictions. Roman writers often joked about the nervousness of brides, the impatience of grooms, the awkwardness of consummation. Martial, the satirist, sneered at husbands too eager, wives too reluctant. The poet Catullus, in contrast, sang of passion so raw it felt closer to obsession than to duty. Between duty and desire, between law and longing, the Roman wedding bed became a stage for comedy, tragedy, and scandal alike. And scandal was never far away. Take the case of Julia, daughter of Augustus. Born into privilege, she was married off 3 times, each union designed to secure Rome's political stability. Yet Julia resisted the role of silent matron. She was accused of taking lovers openly, even conducting trysts in the forum itself. When her affairs became impossible to ignore, Augustus, Rome's moral reformer, the champion of chastity, banished his own daughter to a desolate island. Her crime was not merely infidelity, but betrayal of the state itself. This harsh punishment reveals the brutal truth of Roman matrimony. While men might indulge in mistresses or slaves, women bore the weight of moral expectation. Their fidelity was not personal but political. To betray a husband was to betray a lineage and by extension Rome itself. But desire once again refused to remain caged. Love poetry from the period suggests that behind the walls of arranged unions, passion still found its way. Ovid, in his Ars Amatoria, offered sly advice to young men seeking lovers: look in theaters, in temples, even at the races. His tone was playful, almost mischievous, as though mocking the rigid seriousness of marriage. But Augustus found nothing amusing. He exiled Ovid for a poem and a mistake, the details of which remain cloaked in mystery. Was it truly his poetry that scandalized Rome, or the possibility that art might inspire rebellion against duty? Marriage was also a theater of appearances. Roman matrons were expected to project dignity, modesty, and restraint. Their clothing reflected this: long stolas, veils, jewelry that signaled wealth without inviting suspicion of vanity. Yet cosmetics tell another story. Archaeological finds from Pompeii reveal lead-based powders, cinnabar rouge, and elaborate perfumes. Roman satirists mocked women for their painted faces, calling them deceitful, false, even poisonous. And yet, the same men who derided cosmetics expected their wives to remain beautiful. It was a double bind: be pure but alluring, modest yet desirable, silent yet the ornament of your husband's power. Behind closed doors the contradictions deepened. Marriage could be tender. Some inscriptions reveal couples who spoke of love, fidelity, and partnership. Others, however, expose darker realities: abuse, neglect, and betrayal. Divorce was not uncommon, especially among the elite, where alliances shifted like the tides of politics. Women once married could technically divorce as well, though the social stigma often fell more heavily on them. By the late Republic, marriage had become so fluid that satirists claimed Roman women counted years not by consuls, but by husbands. Yet through all this, one thing remained constant: marriage was never merely personal. It was a stage upon which the drama of empire was performed. Every bride carried not only her dowry, but the weight of her family's ambitions. Every groom, no matter how reluctant, bore the responsibility of ensuring heirs. Every bed, whether warm with passion or cold with duty, was a cornerstone of Rome's survival. To the Romans, then, marriage was less about love and more about legacy. It was an institution where bodies became instruments, where intimacy was harnessed for power, where even the softest whispers in the dark could echo in the Senate halls. And so, the Roman wedding bed was never truly private. It was watched, judged, and remembered. It was a place where women proved their virtue, men asserted their dominance, and the empire itself secured its future. In the end, Roman marriage was not simply about two individuals. It was about Rome itself, its power, its order, its destiny, woven into every vow, every embrace, every heir born into its marble corridors. The streets of ancient Rome told two different stories: one of virtue, whispered in marble halls, and another of raw survival, carved into the shadows of taverns and alleyways. By day, the city gleamed with temples, triumphal arches, and bustling markets. By night, another Rome stirred, one of taverns thick with smoke, of women painted in garish colors, of men slipping through backstreets toward dimly lit rooms. This was the Rome of prostitutes, entertainers, and courtesans, women who lived outside the strict boundaries of pudicitia. For respectable matrons, chastity was everything. For prostitutes, chastity was irrelevant. Their worth lay not in virtue but in performance. The courtesans, daughters of Venus. At the higher end of this spectrum stood the meretresses, courtesans whose lives, though morally condemned, often glittered with a dangerous allure. Some were educated, able to sing, dance, and recite poetry. They dressed not in the plain, muted stolas of Roman matrons, but in bright silks, sheer fabrics, and jewelry that flashed in torchlight. They painted their faces with lead-based powders, their lips with vermilion, their eyelids with ground malachite. Their beauty was a weapon sharpened against poverty. To some men, these women represented not sin but escape. In the embrace of a courtesan, a senator could forget the rigid expectations of Roman matrimony. He could confess, indulge, or experiment without fear of judgment. But such indulgence carried risks. To be seen in the company of a courtesan might tarnish a man's reputation. To love one openly could destroy him. The poets, however, could not resist. Ovid, master of seduction, filled his amours with tales of passionate encounters, of bedsheets still warm, of clandestine trysts. Whether his lovers were respectable women or courtesans remains unclear, but his verses capture the intoxicating atmosphere of a culture where desire constantly tested the limits of respectability. The prostitutes of the Subura. If courtesans inhabited the gilded edge of vice, the city's thousands of street prostitutes lived in its gutter. The Subura, a sprawling, chaotic district in Rome, was infamous for crime, poverty, and sex. Here women and men sold their bodies for a handful of coins. Their brothels were small, dim rooms with stone beds and thin mattresses. Some rooms still exist in Pompeii, their walls decorated with explicit frescoes that served as advertisements. Here, every act had a price. The state both tolerated and regulated prostitution. Brothel keepers had to register with authorities, and prostitutes were often required to wear the toga muliebris, a garment typically reserved for men, marking them as outside the respectable order of Roman womanhood. This clothing was no accident. It stripped them of feminine modesty, branding them as sexual commodities. Yet even in this world of shadows, stories of survival and resilience emerge. A prostitute might, through wit or beauty, gain the patronage of a wealthy man and climb into the ranks of courtesans. Others were trapped forever, their bodies consumed by poverty, disease, and the cruelty of men who saw them as disposable. the slaves of desire. Beneath courtesans and prostitutes stood another group, those who had no choice at all. Enslaved men and women were subject to the sexual whims of their masters. A Roman household often contained young slave girls or boys whose only purpose was to serve in the bedroom. They were property, not people. Their silence was demanded, their suffering went unrecorded. And yet, even here, power dynamics were complicated. A slave who became the favored lover of a wealthy master or mistress might rise in status, gain privileges, or even secure freedom. Desire, in Rome, was never separate from hierarchy, it either crushed or elevated depending on who wielded it. Religion and the sacred prostitutes. Roman sexuality also wore a sacred mask. Certain temples, particularly those dedicated to Venus or fertility cults imported from the East, became associated with ritualized sex. Though scholars debate the extent of temple prostitution in Rome itself, the Romans were fascinated, and sometimes scandalized, by the idea of sacred sexuality practiced in foreign lands. To them, the merging of the divine with desire was both alluring and terrifying, a reminder that sex was not just physical but spiritual, a force capable of binding mortals to the gods. The double standard. What united these worlds, from courtesans in jeweled sandals to slaves forced into silence, was Rome's unforgiving double standard. A man could indulge freely so long as he preserved his dominance. A woman, unless she was already cast out of respectability, risked everything. Even the language reflects this cruelty. Words like meretrix, prostitute, carried layers of disdain, while terms for male clients often implied little judgment. A matron who strayed might be condemned, disgraced, or even killed. But a man's infidelities were shrugged off as natural appetites. And yet, despite moral condemnation, prostitution thrived. Why? Because Rome itself was built on contradictions. The same society that worshipped Pudicitia also filled its art, its poetry, and its streets with sex. The same empire that demanded virtue from its women kept brothels open on every corner. The same voices that condemned prostitutes in public whispered their names in private. Masks and mirrors. To walk through Rome at night was to see these contradictions in motion. A senator slipping out of a tavern, his cloak pulled tight. A courtesan reclining on a couch, reciting poetry while her client watched with hungry eyes. A slave girl carrying a tray of wine, her face carefully blank. A streetwalker waiting beneath an archway, her body for sale to whoever could pay. Each played a role, each wore a mask. And behind those masks lay the truth. In Rome, desire was never just about pleasure. It was about survival, power, and the thin line between shame and allure. The courtesan could ruin a statesman. The prostitute could feed her children with coins earned in the shadows. The slave could navigate a dangerous intimacy that might mean life or death. All of them lived at the intersection of sex and society, where the most private acts became public currency. And so, when we think of Roman sexuality, we must think not only of marble villas and silk sheets, but of alleys, brothels, and the human cost of desire. Rome was an empire of masks, and nowhere were those masks more vividly painted than on the faces of women who sold what others claimed to guard: their bodies, their beauty, their souls. Rome was a city of excess. Its markets overflowed with spices from Arabia, silk from China, and wine from Gaul. Its streets echoed with the laughter of festivals, the chants of parades, and the screams of gladiators in the arena. In such a world of spectacle, desire could never be simple. It had to be performed. It had to be consumed, just like the empire itself. At the heart of this spectacle lay a paradox. The Romans both celebrated and feared pleasure. They built temples to Venus, goddess of love, and filled their villas with frescoes of erotic scenes. And yet, their philosophers warned against indulgence, painting lust as a path to ruin. Roman sexuality was not only intimate, it was theatrical, dangerous, and often violent. The allure of the gladiator. Few figures embodied this paradox more than the gladiator. To the Roman elite, gladiators were slaves, men marked by shame, forced to kill or die for entertainment. Yet in the private fantasies of Roman women, and indeed some men, they were irresistible. Graffiti in Pompeii tells us of women swooning over gladiators. One inscription praises a fighter as the delight of all the girls. Another proclaims a certain Celadus, the heartthrob of the maidens. The appeal was obvious: strength, danger, the scent of sweat and blood. To sleep with a gladiator was taboo, but it was also a thrill that crossed the boundaries of class and respectability. The poet Juvenal, dripping with sarcasm, scolds Roman matrons for abandoning noble husbands in favor of scarred fighters. But perhaps his outrage reveals a deeper truth. Even in a society obsessed with hierarchy, desire could not always be contained. The world's oldest profession. If gladiators embodied forbidden desire, prostitutes represented desire commodified. Rome teemed with them, women and men, slaves and freed, standing at street corners, waiting in dim taverns, or working in purpose-built brothels, lupaneria. The remains of these brothels survive in Pompeii, narrow stone rooms with beds built into the walls and above them, frescoes illustrating the services on offer. Each painting was a kind of menu, guiding clients to pleasures both ordinary and exotic. Prices were shockingly low. A visit could cost less than a loaf of bread, making prostitution accessible even to the poor. But the trade was not without stigma. Prostitutes were branded as infames, people without honor. They could never testify in court, never climb the social ladder. For some, the profession was a trap from which there was no escape. For others, especially clever courtesans, it was a path to influence. Take the story of Volumnia Cytheris, a freedwoman and actress who became the mistress of powerful men, including Mark Antony. Though mocked by Roman elites, she wielded her beauty as a form of currency, her bed as a political stage. In this way, even those branded as dishonorable could, at times, bend desire into power. The art of seduction. But sex in Rome was not always about purchase or power, it was also about art. Erotic manuals circulated, offering advice on pleasure. Ovid's Ars Amatoria, the art of love, taught men and women how to seduce, how to maintain affairs, and how to keep desire alive. He advised women to study mirrors, to learn the language of the eyes, to master the play of gestures. He urged men to win favor with poetry, gifts, and patience. It was playful, witty, and daring. But it also cost Ovid dearly. Augustus, furious at the poet's irreverence toward morality, banished him to the edge of the empire. The message was clear. In Rome, even writing about sex could be an act of rebellion. Pleasure and poison. Beneath this playfulness, however, lurked danger. Roman cosmetics, as we saw earlier, were often laced with lead or mercury. Aphrodisiacs mixed herbs with substances that could just as easily kill as arouse. Even perfumes could be suspect, overwhelming the senses, blurring the line between intoxication and obsession. Love for the Romans was rarely safe. It was a gamble played in the shadow of death, the theater of desire. All of this, the gladiator's sweat, the prostitute's sighs, the poet's verses, the dangerous powders in a lover's cup, formed what we might call Rome's theater of desire. It was not hidden. It was public, performed, painted, carved in stone. It was both celebrated and condemned, embraced and feared. And in this theater, Romans revealed something profound. They understood that sex was never just about the body. It was about spectacle, about control, about the eternal dance between pleasure and power. From the arenas soaked in blood to the brothels painted with fantasies, from Ovid's playful verses to the stern warnings of moralists, Rome's world of desire burned brightly, dangerous, intoxicating, impossible to ignore. But even the grandest theaters must go dark. In Pompeii, the curtains fell not with applause but with ash. The frescoes of lovers, the beds of prostitutes, the graffiti of gladiator crushes, all were buried in silence. And yet, preserved in stone and memory, they still whisper to us across centuries. Desire is fleeting, but its echoes endure. By the 3rd century CE, Rome was beginning to crack. Plagues, invasions, and political assassinations tore at the empire's heart. The world that had once celebrated beauty, excess, and the pleasures of the flesh was now turning toward fear, restraint, and spiritual salvation. Sex, once a public spectacle, was now increasingly cast as sin. The Christian Revolution. When Christianity began to spread across the empire, it clashed head-on with Rome's traditions of lust and spectacle. Early Christians preached chastity, fidelity, and purity of the soul. To them, sex was not theater, it was a dangerous temptation that distracted from God. Church fathers such as Augustine wrote passionately against sexual indulgence. Augustine himself had lived a youth of desire, keeping mistresses and fathering a child out of wedlock. But once converted, he condemned lust as a corruption of the body and a chain that bound the soul to sin. His famous declaration, "Grant me chastity and continence, but not yet," reveals the struggle between human longing and divine command. To Christians, the brothel was no longer just a place of shame, it was a portal to damnation. Adultery was not only a crime against the family, but a wound against God. Pleasure was redefined as sin, unless sanctified within the narrow walls of marriage. The fall of the old gods. As Christianity rose, the old gods of love, lust, and fertility faded. Temples to Venus were abandoned, their altars silent. Statues of Priapus, once symbols of fertility, were smashed or hidden. The erotic frescoes of Pompeii and Herculaneum, uncovered centuries later, shocked the prudish sensibilities of Europe's later moral codes. The empire that had once painted its walls with lovers and adorned its gardens with phallic charms was now turning its gaze to the cross. Sex and power transformed. But the Christian Revolution was not only about morality, it was also about power. By redefining desire as sin, the Church took control of one of the most intimate aspects of human life. Marriage became a sacred contract overseen by priests. The body became a battlefield between temptation and salvation. Desire, once celebrated as a form of vitality, was now something to confess, to purge, to fear. And yet, echoes of the old world remained. In secret, people still painted, still desired, still whispered in the dark. Human longing could never be erased, only reshaped. The legacy of Roman desire. So what do we make of Rome's long journey, from painted cheeks and dangerous powders, to brothels and gladiators, to sermons on chastity? Perhaps the lesson is this: sexuality has always been a mirror. In Rome it reflected ambition, class, and spectacle. In Christianity it reflected guilt, purity, and control. Across time, it continues to reveal who we are, what we fear, and what we long for. The ashes of Pompeii, the verses of Ovid, the warnings of Augustine, all remind us that desire is not a footnote in history. It is history. It shapes civilizations as surely as armies and empires. Epilogue: desire endures. Today, when we walk through the ruins of Pompeii and gaze at the frescoes of lovers, we are reminded of a truth the Romans knew all too well. Life is short, pleasure is fleeting, and desire always leaves its mark. The empire fell, the gods were silenced, the brothels crumbled. But the whispers remain. In the end, Rome teaches us not only about conquest and decline, but about the eternal fire of human longing, flickering in every age, in every heart, across all empires. If history is written by emperors, then Rome's story of desire is painted in scandal. Behind marble columns and golden thrones, passion shaped politics, alliances, and even the fate of empires. Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, seduction as statecraft. No tale of Roman desire is complete without Cleopatra. The Egyptian queen was not merely a beauty, she was a strategist who understood that sex could be as sharp as any sword. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria, Cleopatra smuggled herself into his palace rolled up in a carpet, only to be unveiled at his feet. Ancient writers claim Caesar was instantly captivated. Their affair produced a son, Caesarion, and bound Rome and Egypt together in a web of passion and politics. Later, Cleopatra would repeat the pattern with Mark Antony. Together they lived in luxury, parading themselves as gods, drinking, feasting, and making love openly. To their enemies in Rome, this was decadence incarnate. To Cleopatra, it was survival. Her lovers were not only men but empires. Caligula, madness of desire. If Cleopatra used sex to wield power, Emperor Caligula used power to indulge sex. His reign, 37 to 41 CE, was a carnival of excess. Ancient sources describe him hosting feasts where senators' wives were taken from their seats and used as entertainment. He allegedly built floating pleasure barges on Lake Nemi, filled with gardens, baths, and women. But his darkest legacy was the collapse of boundaries, between ruler and ruled, sacred and profane, love and cruelty. For Romans, Caligula became a symbol of what happens when desire consumes the state. Messalina, the insatiable empress. Another legend of lust belongs to Valeria Messalina, the wife of Emperor Claudius. She was notorious for her affairs, so much so that ancient historians accused her of competing with prostitutes in contests of endurance. One tale claims she entered a brothel disguised as a common courtesan, sleeping with countless men in a single night, only to return to the palace by dawn. Whether exaggerated or true, the story reveals Rome's obsession with the female body as both dangerous and fascinating. Her end was as dramatic as her life. When she attempted to marry her lover while Claudius was away, the emperor ordered her execution. Desire in Rome could be deadly. Graffiti of Pompeii, the people speak. Not all voices of Roman desire belong to emperors and queens. In Pompeii, the walls themselves spoke. When archaeologists uncovered the buried city, they found thousands of graffiti etched into plaster. Some were simple boast. I screwed the barmaid. Others were love poems. Successus loves Iris, she who does not care. And some were crude drawings of phalluses, reminders that sex was not hidden, it was a part of daily life. These messages, scratched by anonymous hands nearly 2,000 years ago, bring us closer to the ordinary desires of the Roman people. Love, lust, jealousy, betrayal. The politics of morality, Augustus reforms. While scandal filled the palaces and brothels, Rome's first emperor, Augustus, sought to impose order. Alarmed by declining birth rates among the elite, he passed strict marriage laws. Adultery was punished. Marriage was encouraged. Men were even rewarded with political advantages for fathering multiple children. But laws could not erase desire. Senators still kept mistresses. Wives still whispered to lovers in dark corridors. Augustus himself was accused of hypocrisy, preaching morality while indulging in affairs. Rome's struggle was eternal, the tension between public virtue and private passion. The final seduction, lust, and the fall of Rome. As the empire weakened in the 4th and 5th centuries, moralists blamed sexual excess for its decline. Pagan feasts of Bacchus were condemned as orgies. Gladiatorial games were denounced as bloodlust. Brothels were cast as symbols of decadence. Christian writers argued that Rome had fallen not because of barbarian swords, but because of its own sins. The empire that once celebrated desire as vitality was now remembered as a cautionary tale of lust gone too far. Buried secrets, the rediscovery of Pompeii. For more than 1,000 years, Rome's erotic world lay hidden beneath volcanic ash and Christian morality. When Pompeii and Herculaneum were rediscovered in the 18th century, archaeologists were shocked by what they found. On the walls of taverns and homes were explicit frescoes. In private chambers, tiny statues of Priapus, the god of fertility, stood proudly. Brothels with stone beds and erotic paintings were unearthed. To Victorians, this was scandalous. The secret cabinet of the Naples Archaeological Museum was created, locking away these erotic treasures where only men of mature age and sound morals were allowed access. Desire, once celebrated openly in Rome, had become taboo in modern Europe. The Vatican and the erotica of Rome. The Catholic Church faced a dilemma. On one hand, Rome's erotic art was evidence of sin, a reminder of pagan excess. On the other hand, it was history, too valuable to destroy. So the Church censored. Marble statues of nude gods were covered with fig leaves. Erotic frescoes were hidden away. What had once been central to Roman culture became whispers, shadows, and forbidden artifacts. Yet, the very act of censorship made them more intriguing. Scholars and travelers flocked to Italy, eager to glimpse the forbidden rooms of Pompeii. Renaissance revival, art, desire, and Rome's ghost. While the Church suppressed Rome's erotic past, artists of the Renaissance secretly resurrected it. Michelangelo, Raphael, and Titian studied ancient statues, reviving the Roman celebration of the human form. Nude bodies returned to Western art, not as shameful but as divine, heroic, and beautiful. The muscular torsos of Roman gladiators inspired the Sistine Chapel's Adam. The sensual curves of Venus echoed in Botticelli's Birth of Venus. Rome's desire was reborn in brushstrokes and marble, cloaked in the language of art rather than lust. Victorian hypocrisy, lust behind closed doors. By the 19th century, Western society outwardly condemned eroticism, yet secretly consumed it. Scholars translated Roman erotic texts but published them in limited, gentlemen-only editions. For example, the Satyricon of Petronius and the poetry of Ovid were labeled indecent, but circulated among elites. Erotic graffiti from Pompeii was copied into private collections. The Romans had lived their desires openly. The Victorians, in contrast, lived them behind closed doors.